Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for the 28th of March 2023. I'm going to cover some stories that are not getting covered in the national or local press, but which are really crucial stories for shaping what's necessary for the population to be involved in if we're going to see some changes, moving away from war and economic chaos. I'm going to start with the Greens being smashed in a vote in Berlin. I'm going to talk about the breaking up of the big banks, and finally, why the U.S. must finally get troops out of Syria. So let's start with the referendum in Berlin. This was a crushing defeat for the Greens as they had a financial Malthusian policy, a pro-climate referendum, which was defeated. Now, actually, the vote was slightly pro-yes. There were 442,000 yes votes and 423,000 no votes. But they required a quorum of 25% of all voters for this to count. And there were almost 200,000 fewer votes than that. Now, I'm going to quote from a statement issued by the LaRouche Party in Berlin, the Civil Rights Movement Solidarity Party, or BUSO. Which said that the Berlin climate neutrality referendum, as it was called, in which oligarchs had invested over 1.2 million euros, including money from philanthropic foundations in the U.S., failed and failed very badly. As I said, the quorum wasn't met. There had been indications that people decided to stay home rather than vote. Which is unfortunate for the Greens, but quite good for the people of Berlin and more importantly, for Germany. Now, the measures that were included in this climate referendum would have required building renovations, transport and energy conversions that would have cost around 113 billion euros. Berlin's total budget is about 38 billion per year. And this kind of expenditure is typical of what's required if the green policies are going to go into effect. The attempt was to make Berlin climate neutral by 2030. But what that would have required is a financial dictatorship to impose these policies. There was funding for this coming from the United States. One couple, Wenger and Danziger from New York, gave nearly $500,000. So this was not just a Berlin referendum, but one to establish a trend internationally. And its defeat is quite significant. Now, this is similar to other developments occurring in Europe. For example, against the European Union Green Agricultural Policy, there was a large demonstration in The Hague 2 weekends ago. It was followed on March 15th in an election in which the ruling party in the U.S. Senate, in the Dutch Senate, which is a Green party, was voted out of power. So this is another example of a rejection of the Green policy. Now, also take note that in Italy, the Italian government has finally overcome objections to building the Strait of Messina Bridge. This has been opposed for a long time by deficit hawks and environmental nutcases. So the fact that this is going to continue, or will be built rather, is quite important. Now, in the banking situation, the banking crisis is not a banking crisis. It reflects a collapse of the whole financial and economic system. Now, I covered some of this yesterday in terms of the bailouts that are being imposed by governments and central banks, where they're printing and circulating trillions of dollars of liquidity to hide insolvency and worthless paper on the books of banks and corporations. But while they're pumping this financial liquidity into the system, they're pushing austerity for the real economy and for the population, which requires the real economy for sustenance. Now, there's some comments that I just want to call to your attention. Neil Kashkari, who's the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, said that there's been a near freeze on lending to corporations desperate for cash over the last couple of weeks. And this was also reported on Forex Live website, which said that this will lead, if continued, to a sharp contraction in the U.S. economy, which is already taking place. So the question comes up, is it time to break up the big banks instead of bailing them out, instead of giving them access to unlimited volumes of cash, which will go into the hands of speculators to protect speculative assets? Well, this was raised by Lyndon LaRouche in 2007, and especially after the 2008 crash, when he said that what's necessary is a bankruptcy reorganization, starting with the reintroduction of the Glass-Steagall regulations. These were ultimately rejected or dumped in a 1999 bill called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which threw out the Glass-Steagall policy. And what this meant is that commercial banks could work together with investment banks to create large funds, too big to fail banks, actually. And they were too big to fail means that if you don't bail them out, the system collapses. Now, the discussion of Glass-Steagall reorganization is now taking place, including a discussion of, is it time to break up the big banks? And the former editor of the Lex column of London's Financial Times described this discussion as terrifying. But the alternative of a systemic crash is what's looming. So there's growing talk of Glass-Steagall, and I'm going to append at the bottom of the description page an article in the Executive Intelligence Review by our economics editor, Paul Gallagher, on what we're actually facing, not just a banking crisis, but also the solutions to it. Now, finally, on the Syria question, this missile attack on U.S. contractors, one contractor was killed. It led to a counterstrike against supposedly Iranian groups. This is heading for a potential escalation. And it raises the question of, why are U.S. troops still there? There are about 900 U.S. troops. They're illegally in Syria. They haven't been invited. There's no legislation in the U.S. Congress that authorized their presence there. They're there for supposedly protecting anti-terrorist forces and going after ISIS, but they're not doing much against ISIS. In fact, by fighting against the Iranian networks there, the Iranian networks have been effective against ISIS. They're knocking out the effective anti-terrorist fighters. And meanwhile, stealing the oil and farmland needed for the Syrian people. U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby was on Face the Nation on Sunday, and he said, U.S. troops will stay there. We're not getting out because we're fighting ISIS. This is an absolutely false statement. The U.S. has not been fighting ISIS for a while. The containment of ISIS was done by the Syrian army, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and especially with support from Russian military forces. The ISIS forces there were armed and trained and protected by U.S. mercenaries, including those on the payroll of the CIA. Now, there was a vote in the U.S. House to remove the troops. This was brought up by U.S. Rep. Matt Gaetz from Florida, and was part of a move to address the fact that the U.S. troops are there illegally and they're in harm's way. It was voted down, but there were at least 103 votes for it, which shows maybe a little bit of spine growing among some of the congressmen about these illegal wars. Meanwhile, we're seeing a Russian-Chinese diplomatic initiative in the region which has the prospects for peace through development, through cooperation among various nations, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, that had been at odds until recently. Now remember, Kirby, who made this statement, is the same one who ruled out taking up China's peace plan for Ukraine, echoing Biden and Blinken, saying that the U.S. opposes this plan, that China's plan is, quote, unacceptable, which means more and more Ukrainians will die, sacrificed for NATO's war against Russia. Maybe instead of trying to break up Russia, we should break up the U.S. too-big-to-fail banks instead, and the U.S. war machine. Now, tomorrow I'll have a report on what's happening in Israel. As part of the upheaval against governments, we see millions in the streets in France, close to 1 million in the streets in Israel against Netanyahu's fascist reforms. And I say fascist because what they would do is break any possibility of judicial review of actions by the majority coalition in the government. So I'll have some coverage of that. In the meantime, look at Paul Gallagher's article so you can be up to date on what's actually happening with the financial system in the Western world. Thanks for joining me. See you again tomorrow. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.